The universe, in its infinite wisdom and occasional bursts of cosmic humor, had decided that the Zephyrian Military Academy would be the perfect place to conduct an experiment in hubris. Located on the third moon of Kepler 442, this prestigious institution had spent the better part of 3 centuries perfecting the art of breaking young minds and rebuilding them into proper military automatons. The Vorthak Empire, in their characteristic blend of efficiency and cruelty, had designed a system so refined that failure was not just unlikely, it was theoretically impossible. Commander Thexfor stood before the Academy's primary briefing chamber, his 4 arms crossed in what passed for satisfaction among his species. The holographic displays around him showed statistics that would make any military strategist weep with joy: a 99.7% success rate in producing compliant, effective officers from the galaxy's most elite families. The remaining 0.3% had either died or gone insane, which the Vorthak considered acceptable losses in the pursuit of military excellence. Today the Thexfor announced to his assembled staff, his voice carrying the particular smugness that only comes from centuries of unopposed authority, "We welcome our first Terran cadet." The reaction was immediate and predictable. Crystalline officers chimed in harmonious laughter, their bodies refracting light in patterns that conveyed amusement. The insectoid representatives clicked their mandibles in what could charitably be called mirth. Even the usually stoic reptilian contingent allowed themselves the equivalent of a smirk. Humans. Those adorable little primates who had barely learned to walk upright when the galaxy's great civilizations were already building interstellar empires. They were cute, certainly, with their soft skin and expressive faces, but the idea that one of them could survive the Academy's rigorous conditioning was almost insulting to consider. The Terran designation is Marcus Ferro. The Thexfor continued, consulting his datapad with the air of someone discussing a particularly interesting laboratory specimen. Apparently their government believes he represents their finest military potential. More laughter. The notion that a species that still used kinetic weapons and chemical propulsion could produce anything resembling a proper warrior was delicious in its absurdity. What none of them understood, what their vast databases and psychological profiles had somehow failed to capture, was that humans didn't come from the kind of world that produced fragile, easily broken creatures. Earth was a death trap of a planet, where survival required a particular brand of stubborn persistence that the galaxy's more civilized species had long since bred out of themselves. Marcus Ferro stepped off the transport shuttle with the casual confidence of someone who had spent his entire life being underestimated. At first glance, he appeared to validate every assumption the Academy staff had made: average height by galactic standards, unremarkable build, no visible natural weapons or armor. What they missed was the way he moved, not with the cautious deference of most new cadets, but with the loose-limbed ease of a predator surveying new territory. The orientation process began immediately, because the Vorthak believed in efficiency above all else. Cadet Zilthara, a crystalline whose family had produced 12 generations of military excellence, was assigned as Marcus's mentor, a role that traditionally involved psychological dominance disguised as guidance. "Human," she began, her voice carrying harmonics designed to induce submission in most species, "you will address all senior cadets as superior, and all officers as absolute. Failure to do so will result in corrective measures." Marcus tilted his head slightly, the way a wolf might when hearing an interesting sound. "That's a lot of titles to remember. Mind if I just use your names instead? Makes conversation flow better." The silence that followed was the kind that usually precedes either violence or revelation. Zilthara's crystalline form flickered through several colors that indicated confusion, then offense, then a deeper confusion about why her standard dominance protocols weren't working. "Perhaps," she said, her harmonics shifting to a more aggressive frequency, "you misunderstand your position here, human. You are the lowest form of life in this institution. Your species is barely civilized, your planet is a backwater, and your presence here is a courtesy extended to primitives." Marcus considered this with the thoughtful expression of someone genuinely trying to understand a foreign concept. "Huh, that's interesting. So you're saying I should feel bad about myself because I'm human?" "Precisely. But I like being human. We're pretty great actually. We invented jazz music and pizza. Plus we figured out space travel without having to evolve specialized organs for it, which is kind of impressive when you think about it. The first crack in the Academy's perfect system appeared in that moment, though none of the aliens were equipped to recognize it. They had encountered stubbornness before, even defiance, but this was something entirely different. Marcus wasn't rejecting their attempts at humiliation, he was genuinely confused by them, as if the very concept of feeling ashamed for being human was too alien for him to grasp. Cadet Grex Emole, an insectoid whose species prided itself on collective thinking and rigid hierarchies, decided to try a different approach. Your individualistic nature is a weakness, human. Your kind lacks the unity that makes true military strength possible. Oh, we can do unity when we need to. Marcus replied cheerfully. Usually when someone's trying to kill us, we're really good at that actually. Coming together against a common threat, I mean. It's kind of our thing. Empty boasting from a species that still fights among themselves. Well yeah, but that's just practice. Keeps us sharp. Hard to maintain proper combat readiness when everyone gets along all the time. The conversation continued in this vein for several hours, with the alien cadets growing increasingly frustrated as their carefully crafted psychological attacks bounced off Marcus like rain off a duck. Every attempt to make him feel inferior was met with either cheerful agreement yep, we're definitely not the most advanced species, or casual dismissal, yep, but we're working on it. By the end of the first week, word had spread throughout the Academy that something was seriously wrong with their human cadet. Traditional hazing rituals that had broken the spirits of countless young aliens were being treated as minor inconveniences. Sleep deprivation protocols were dismissed with comments about pulling all-nighters in college. Physical challenges designed to push cadets beyond their limits were approached with the enthusiasm of someone trying a new recreational activity. Commander Thexva decided it was time to implement more serious measures. The Crucible was the Academy's ultimate tool for psychological conditioning, a sophisticated torture chamber disguised as a training facility. Cadets were subjected to their species' worst fears, deepest insecurities, and most traumatic scenarios, all carefully calibrated to break down mental defenses and rebuild them according to military specifications. Marcus was strapped into the neural interface with the same clinical efficiency that had processed thousands of cadets before him. The Vorfark technicians activated the system with confident smirks, preparing to witness the complete psychological demolition of their troublesome human. What followed was perhaps the most anticlimactic breakdown in the Academy's history. The fear protocols designed to trigger primal terror responses were met with interested observation. "Oh, that's clever," Marcus commented as holographic monsters materialized around him. "The teeth on that one look like they could punch through armor. Good design choice." Scenarios crafted to induce helplessness and despair were analyzed with the detached curiosity of an academic. "This is basically a zombie apocalypse scenario, right? We've got hundreds of these in our entertainment media. Always wondered what I'd do in this situation." Personal trauma simulations, the Academy's most potent weapon, were perhaps the most telling. The system accessed Marcus's memories, searching for moments of weakness, failure, or loss to weaponize against him. What it found instead was a species that had turned trauma into strength, failure into learning opportunities, and loss into motivation. "Yeah, that was a rough day," Marcus said as the system replayed his worst memory, watching his younger brother die in a training accident. "But it's why I'm here. Someone's got to make sure other people's little brothers come home safe." The technicians stared at their readouts in growing alarm. Not only was the human showing no signs of psychological breakdown, but his stress indicators were actually decreasing as the scenarios progressed. It was as if the Academy's ultimate weapon was having a calming effect on him. "Perhaps," suggested Dr. Velthorn, the Academy's chief psychologist, "we should increase the intensity." They did. Marcus began offering constructive criticism on the scenario's realism and suggesting improvements to make them more effective. When they showed him images designed to trigger species-specific disgust responses, he asked if they had any documentation on the creature's biology because they looked pretty fascinating from an evolutionary standpoint. By the third day of the Crucible, the roles had somehow reversed. The alien staff found themselves seeking Marcus's approval of their psychological torture methods, while he offered helpful suggestions on how to make the experience more educational for future cadets. The fear of abandonment scenario could use some work, he mentioned during a break. Maybe add some environmental hazards. Being left alone is only scary if you can't survive on your own, and humans are really good at surviving on our own. Commander Fexver made the decision to move to physical trials. Surely, he reasoned, the humans' biological limitations would prove more tractable than his psychological ones. The combat simulations were designed to be overwhelming multiple opponents, superior technology, impossible odds. They were meant to teach cadets the futility of individual resistance and the necessity of following orders without question. Marcus approached them like puzzle games. Interesting tactical problem, he mused as he faced down a squad of holographic Vorthark warriors. 4 arms gives you guys a significant advantage in close combat, but it also means more limbs to target. And that armor looks impressive, but I bet it restricts mobility. What followed was a systematic dismantling of everything the Academy thought it knew about combat doctrine. Marcus didn't fight like the civilized species they were used to, he fought like something that had evolved to kill things that were bigger, stronger and better armed than himself. He used the environment as a weapon, turning training obstacles into traps. He employed tactics that the aliens found disturbingly primitive yet undeniably effective. Most unsettling of all, he seemed to enjoy the challenge, treating each increasingly difficult scenario as an opportunity to test new approaches. You know, he said after defeating a simulation designed to be mathematically impossible to win, this is really helping me understand galactic military doctrine. You guys fight like you've never had to worry about losing, which makes sense given your technological advantages. But it also makes you predictable. The word predictable struck the alien staff like a physical blow. Predictability was weakness in military terms, and weakness was the one thing their perfect system was supposed to eliminate. Cadet Silphara found herself in the unprecedented position of seeking guidance from someone she was supposed to be breaking. How do you do it? She asked during what was supposed to be a punishment detail. How do you remain so intact? Marcus considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. I think maybe you're approaching this wrong. You're trying to break me down so you can build me back up into what you want, right? That is the standard procedure, yes. But humans don't really work that way. We're not made to be broken down and rebuilt. We're made to adapt, to learn, to grow stronger from adversity. Every challenge you throw at me just makes me better at handling challenges. That is not how military conditioning is supposed to function. Maybe that's the problem. You're trying to create soldiers by breaking people, but what if some people get stronger when you try to break them? The conversation that followed would later be studied by military psychologists across the galaxy. Zilphara, who had entered the Academy as the epitome of crystalline perfection, found herself questioning everything she had been taught about strength, discipline and military excellence. Other cadets began to notice. Greximol started asking Marcus about human pack hunting strategies. Even some of the reptilian cadets, traditionally the most rigid adherents to hierarchy, began seeking his input on tactical problems. The Academy's perfect system was experiencing something it had never encountered in 3 centuries of operation: a student who improved it by refusing to be improved by it. Commander Fexver called an emergency meeting of the senior staff. The holographic displays that usually showed compliance statistics and psychological profiles now displayed graphs that told a story of institutional failure. Marcus Ferro wasn't just resisting their conditioning, he was somehow conditioning everyone around him. The human is a contamination, declared Dr. Velthorn. His influence is spreading to other cadets. They're beginning to question established protocols. Questioning is not necessarily problematic, ventured Captain Mextel, one of the few staff members who had begun to see the situation in a different light. Perhaps we should consider what the humans' methods might teach us. The suggestion was met with the kind of horrified silence usually reserved for suggestions of treason. You're proposing, Vexver said slowly, that we learn from a primitive who has failed every conditioning protocol we've applied. I'm proposing that perhaps he hasn't failed, perhaps we have. The final confrontation came during the Academy's ultimate test, the command scenario. Cadets were placed in charge of a simulated fleet facing impossible odds, with the expectation that they would follow established doctrine and accept inevitable defeat with proper military dignity. Marcus took one look at the tactical display and laughed. "Oh, this is based on the Battle of Kepler 186, isn't it?" "Yeah, we studied this at the Terran Naval Academy." Classic example of how superior technology can be overcome by unconventional thinking. He proceeded to implement a strategy that violated every principle of accepted galactic warfare and won decisively. "The problem with your doctrine," he explained to the stunned observers, "is that it assumes everyone thinks the same way you do. But humans develop military strategy fighting other humans, and we're really good at thinking around problems instead of through them." The silence that followed was broken by slow, deliberate applause from Captain Mextel. "Brilliant," the reptilian officer said. "Absolutely brilliant. You didn't just solve the scenario, you revealed its fundamental assumptions." Commander Thexver stared at the tactical display as if it had personally betrayed him. Everything the Academy stood for, everything they had built their reputation on, had just been casually dismantled by a species they had dismissed as primitive. "This is not possible," he muttered. "The conditioning protocols are perfect. The system is infallible." "Maybe," Marcus suggested with the gentle tone of someone trying not to hurt feelings, "the system works great for species that are designed to be broken down and rebuilt. But humans aren't really designed that way. We're more like adaptive systems. We get stronger under pressure instead of weaker." The realization that followed was perhaps the most humbling moment in Vorfark military history. They had built their entire academy around the assumption that all sapient species shared the same psychological architecture. The possibility that some species might respond to adversity by becoming more dangerous rather than more compliant had never occurred to them. Over the following weeks, Marcus became something unprecedented in the Academy's history, a student who taught more than he learned. Not through formal instruction but simply by being himself, by refusing to be diminished, by treating every challenge as an opportunity, by remaining stubbornly, unshakably human. The other cadets began to change, not because they were being conditioned but because they were being inspired. Zilphar discovered that her natural crystalline resonance could be used for communication rather than domination. Grexima learned that individual initiative could enhance collective action rather than threaten it. Even the staff began to evolve. Officers who had spent decades perfecting the art of breaking spirits found themselves learning the more complex skill of nurturing strength. The Academy's graduation ceremony that year was unlike any in its history. Instead of presenting perfectly conditioned officers ready to follow orders without question, they commissioned leaders who had learned to think, to adapt, and to find strength in adversity. Marcus stood with his fellow graduates, wearing the same uniform as everyone else but somehow making it look different, not because he had been broken down and rebuilt, but because he had remained essentially himself while growing into something more. Commander Thexver, in a moment of unprecedented humility, approached him after the ceremony. "Cadet Ferro," he said, and the use of the human's name rather than his species designation was significant. "I owe you an apology. We tried to break you because we believed that was how strength was forged." "No harm done," Marcus replied with characteristic equanimity. "Besides, you did make me stronger, just not in the way you expected." "Indeed. Tell me, what do you think you've learned here?" Marcus considered the question seriously. "I learned that strength comes in different forms. That sometimes the best way to help someone become their best self isn't to tear them down but to challenge them to rise up. And that maybe, just maybe, the galaxy might benefit from a few more people who refuse to be broken." As the new graduates dispersed to their various assignments across the galaxy, they carried with them something the Academy had never intended to teach: the understanding that true military excellence came not from crushing individuality but from nurturing it within a framework of mutual respect and shared purpose. The Zephyrian Military Academy statistics would never again show a 99.7% success rate in producing identical officers. Instead, they would show something far more valuable, a 100% success rate in producing leaders who were stronger for having been tested, wiser for having been challenged,
and more effective for having learned that sometimes the best way to cage an apex predator is to convince it that the cage is actually a training ground. The universe, in its infinite wisdom and occasional bursts of cosmic humor, had taught the galaxy's most prestigious military institution a lesson they would never forget. Some things are meant to be unbreakable, and the wise learn to work with that reality rather than against it. And somewhere in the depths of space, on ships and stations and colonies across 1,000 worlds, the Academy's graduates carried that lesson with them, along with the quiet confidence that comes from knowing that true strength isn't about refusing to bend, but about never forgetting how to stand back up.